As many of you will know, my teenage years were spent at the church here. We moved to the area when I was 11, and I was reminded the other week of one occasion sitting in the assistant minister's lounge. At that point, he was helping to run our youth life group, and we didn't call it life group, but that was basically what it was. And at the end of the session, he said, I'm just going to kind of give you a kind of a prequel, really, as to what's going to come next week and what we're going to be looking at. And he said, I need 4 volunteers. So I need 2 girls, 2 boys. And then he gave some very simple instructions to them. He said, I want you to make love on the floor. Yeah, talk about how to terrify and confuse young people, giving them that sense of feeling awkward, unsure, and certain that the last place any of us wanted to be was in that room at that point. If you know Danny Pritchard, who was the assistant minister, it will make a little more sense. He knew full well we would completely misunderstand what he was talking about. What he was actually hoping we would do is, the 4 of them, would be to spell out the word love with their bodies. So kind of L-O-V-E. That wasn't where our minds went to at all, though, as I said, and we all looked at the door thinking, I really wish I'd come up with an excuse, thus I wasn't there that evening. I was reminded of this, because I wonder whether there's a similar sort of awkwardness when we come to today's passage, but also when we come to look at some of the things within the Sermon on the Mount. Because actually, as Emma said, we talk about it as like this sermon, this talk that Jesus did up a mountain. And if you've been to Galilee, you think, oh, it's lovely and picturesque and that sort of thing. But actually, the stuff Jesus is talking about, the things he is unpacking, are really quite challenging. And actually can really leave us sometimes going, I really wish I was somewhere else. And do I really need to think this through? Is this really for me, or can it just be for the person next to me who needs to grapple with this? If you haven't already, I'd love you to turn to Matthew 5, where we're continuing and looking at 2 areas this morning, 2 sections of the Sermon on the Mount, both that I think could be potentially misunderstood, misused, or maybe we do a bit of both. But I think it's these words of Jesus that he's raising a challenge on a specific situation, not the topic of a whole, as I'll come to explain. But Matthew 5, 27 to 32. And just say, if you haven't got a Bible, we'd love to gift you one as a church. So do please speak to Emma or I afterwards. We're going to read from Matthew 5, verse 27 to 32. You have heard what it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Continuing, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. As I've shared before, one of the questions that I often ask when I come to prepare a talk is what excites and grabs me about the particular passage that I'm going to be sharing on. I'll be honest, when I came to prepare for today, I simply wrote the word down, nothing. And I don't share that because it's kind of, it's fun, isn't it? I share that because that's what I did. Because I read this and nothing grabbed me, nothing excited me. And I think the reason for that is that these aren't abstract concepts or topics. They are real, they are challenging, and they raise questions, and they impact us in different ways. Many sitting here today, I'm aware, whether that's kind of at arm's length, if you will, whether it's family or friends or colleagues who've been affected, or maybe it's much more personal. And actually, this is something you have known and gone through firsthand. That said, in many ways, I think that reminds us that, living a life as a disciple of Jesus isn't about separating ourselves off from the world around us. The series, we called it Words to Live By. Jesus is talking about what it means to be a disciple in the world, what it means to follow him. And it's about being different and distinct, yes, but it's also about engaging and grappling with the issues that we face as we go through life. Now, these passages very much kind of, I suppose, build off the previous 6 verses that Dom spoke about last Sunday, if you were here, when he spoke about, Jesus' response to the commandment, do not murder. And it's very much this kind of continued real-world application, taking a familiar law only to raise the bar, and then some, if you will. I was thinking about this. One of the titles originally considered for this series was The Upside Down Kingdom, because that's what Jesus is talking about here. It's actually about living in a completely upside down way to much of what we experience or we're told in the world around us. Yeah, and one commentator actually kind of grouped the previous 6 verses, so those that Dom spoke about and those that I've just read, together, because actually what Jesus is talking about here across these 3 different sections is living lives that model righteousness. What does it mean to do right by others? So turning to the passage, Jesus, as he continues his sermon, verse 27, moves on to the topic of adultery. He's quoting Exodus 20 and verse 14, Exodus being the second book of the Bible. Within it, we read about the Exodus, God's people, the Israelites, leaving Egypt, and all that follows. But within that as well includes the giving of the 10 Commandments. Now, I love the idea, if you were here 2 weeks ago, I think Jenny mentioned, of a spiritual ambush, which is kind of what Jesus does here. He says, you have heard it said, but he then quotes the Old Testament, what you've heard, but then continues, but I say, and kind of takes it on a whole different level. Here he's quoting number 7 of the 10 Commandments. You have heard what it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Jesus, though, he elevates it. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, let's just be clear, so there's no misunderstanding, what Jesus is not saying here. He's not saying finding someone you are not married to attractive is a sin. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying, though, is that extra look, that creepy stare, that objectifying in our minds, that needs to be dealt with. There is no place for that, even though we might think it's with a bit of banter and a bit of humour maybe with other people. It's not acceptable at all. What he's saying again is to follow me means there is a higher standard that you need to live by. And this is serious stuff as it goes on, the extreme steps that he suggests, gouging out eyes if they cause you to stumble, cutting off your right arm and throwing it away. That is how serious this is. Now, we might ask the question, was Jesus expecting his listeners to physically go away, unable to see? Or to have him, mutilated themselves and cut an arm off. What Jesus is getting here is that it's about doing whatever it takes. The Bible Project, they put it this way. They say it's important to remember that Jesus was raised on the Hebrew Scriptures, which portray sex as a beautiful thing. But if sexual desire is causing us to dishonor the image of God in others or in ourselves, or it's causing breakdown in our relationships, it's actually harming us. And we need to do whatever it takes to correct this behavior. Next topic Jesus goes on to is divorce. Again, those sitting there that day, maybe they weren't expecting this. But in a similar pattern, verse 31, it says, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Jesus here is quoting the Hebrew Scriptures. This time it's Deuteronomy, verse 24, verse 1. And it's important, I suppose, to get our heads around the context that Jesus is speaking into here. You see, in Jesus' days, only Israelite men could initiate divorce. We might not like that. We might kind of go, but that's not right, is it? But that is the context that Jesus is speaking into. So we need to kind of put our heads in that space. Now, obviously, that imbalance wasn't a good thing. But then, for Jesus, divorce was only allowed in this kind of realm. And there was only one law in the Torah, which is the Hebrew scripture, that actually speaks about it, that refers to it. And it's the one that Jesus had just quoted to them. And in a nutshell, it goes on, it says this, it says that if a man initiates a divorce, he has to do it in the proper way and for a legitimate reason. Which might lead us to the question of going, well, what is a legitimate reason? And this is where kind of, again, the situation on that day as Jesus spoke, we see things that obviously started to unravel a little bit. Because see, on the one hand, there were those who said, well, divorce was allowed, but only if there had been adultery. That is the only reason someone can get divorced. But on the other hand, there were those at that time who were kind of saying, well, divorce is actually allowed for a whole load of different reasons. Actually, yeah, just take your pick. Or actually, just make one up, really. Because you'll probably find someone who will back you up in it. And actually, it may just be that you don't really fancy being married to that person anymore. It may be that they just burnt their meal. Well, actually, whatever it is, that's fine. You just kind of come up with it and go with it. And it's into this specific debate that Jesus is speaking. Clearly advocating for the former view that if at all, divorce should be allowed only if there has been adultery, but very much against this pick and mix culture that had arisen of basically, if it suits you and if you fancy it, then just go for it, really. That's fine. Now we see Jesus speaks on divorce later in Matthew in chapter 19. And it's commenting on these verses, interestingly, that the commentator Leah Morris, he says, kind of above all, though, the fact that divorce was possible did not mean that it ought to be sought. Rather, it has to be seen as a desperate last resort. Every effort must be made to save a marriage. Saying that, that's not always possible. And Jesus, I think, recognized that, and that's why he was saying what he did. And when it comes to that last verse, verse 32, where Jesus says, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery, again, it's seeing that within the specific situation that Jesus is speaking into. You see, in first century context, a divorced woman would often socially and economically be forced to remarry, simply to survive. It wasn't kind of an option of if she fancied someone else. No, it would have been probably the natural course she would have had to have taken. So again, by unjustly divorcing her, her husband causes her to be viewed as an adulteress if she remarries. Now again, we may not agree with that, but that's the context of that time. And so that pressures her into a situation of adultery because of the original covenant being broken. In other words, Jesus is referring to marrying someone who was divorced without the valid reason which I've just mentioned. So again, against this culture of pick and choose as you will. And so it suggests that in God's eyes, the original binding marriage covenant would still exist, rendering a second marriage illegitimate. Now, the danger with all of this is that we could hear this and we could kind of say, so if Jesus is saying adultery is the only reason divorce is allowed, what about abuse? What about neglect? What about any other kind of form of physical or mental harm, for example? And the thing is, and the challenge is, that's not what this passage is referring to. Because again, Jesus is responding to a specific situation and text. So where do we go from here? How do we apply this? How do we kind of respond to it in our lives? I believe Jesus is saying two things that we need to maybe hear and we maybe need to grapple with and work through in our lives. Kind of in reverse. In verses 31 and 32, yes, Jesus is talking about divorce. But I think actually Jesus is speaking about the wonder and the gift of marriage. That's what he's getting at. Marriage is not something that comes under the pick and choose realm in life. You know, divorce it is not the ideal, and there are reasons, and there are situations, and there are times when that is the appropriate step to be taken in a relationship. And I haven't faced that. I don't stand here as someone who knows what it's like to have gone through that and to grappled with it. But what Jesus is saying is divorce is not to be taken lightly or to be on a whim, very much as become the culture back then. And therefore, for those of us who are married, it's how are we going to ensure our marriages thrive? What's our response going to be? How is that on us? And how are we going to do everything we can to make sure that happens? You know, I was reminded this morning, remember in the past as a church, we've run the marriage course. Not a course for those whose marriages are in trouble, but actually for those who go, I want to have the best marriage I can, and I want any support and help I can get. And maybe that's something that would be good to explore again in the future. But kind of then moving back to verses 27 to 30, I think the challenge that Jesus puts before us is how we need to deal ruthlessly with the first signs of lust. Again, something we don't really like to talk about, and probably maybe aren't enjoying a talk on this morning, if we're honest, because it's awkward. And it's not something we like to chat about. It's not something we're openly honest about, maybe. And I don't think it's just blokes. I'm a bloke standing here, and I'm aware blokes do have a lot of issues. It's not also those who are just married or in a relationship. Interestingly, if you follow Lectio 365, the devotional series this week, as they've explored various different topics, on Wednesday it looked at lust, referencing Colossians 3, 1-5. Encourage you to go and read those verses, but they said this passage challenges us to let nothing, no desire, no person, no wealth, take Jesus' place in our heart, our mind, or our body. And they pose these questions, you know, am I turning towards temptation? Do I talk honestly with God about my struggles? Am I looking for fulfillment, comfort, or even salvation in something other than Him? And these are big questions. And again, these are kind of uncomfortable questions. But they're questions that I think we need to have worked through. We need to have grappled with. And I suppose in a bigger sense, really, what Jesus is talking about here is he's talking against what has become acceptable, what had become the norm. And maybe that's the question we need to ask in our lives. What is it that's become acceptable? What has become the norm? Or to look at it another way, to flip it on its head, how do we treat every human being as they have the ultimate value because they are made in the image of God? That's where I suddenly come unstuck a little bit. And I go, but there are people who I'm not quite sure. And there are people maybe I can think of exceptions. But actually, how am I following Jesus, willing to show the love that He has for me to anyone and everyone I meet? I want to invite the band to come back up as I draw to a close. Tom Wright, he summarizes these verses. And he says this, he says, perhaps the most important thing to say here, though, is that Jesus doesn't want his hearers or the later church to get embroiled in endless debates about what precisely was allowed. He says this, he says, far, far more important to think about how to be the light of the world, the salt of the earth. And in the area of sexual behavior, the answer is clear, bracing, and just as challenging today as it was to the wider pagan world of the first century, treating every human as they have ultimate value. Now, today is not one of those moments where I'm going to invite people to respond, to raise your hands, to come out the front. But that's not to say there aren't things that we need to do business with God over, perhaps. And maybe that's we need to get in touch with someone in the week, our life group leader or someone we are open and accountable to, maybe in a prayer triplet. Emma and I, obviously here, would be willing to listen, to pray, and to cheer you on in any way we can. But if God has been speaking to you this morning, if you've felt that nudge of something that you need to deal with, don't ignore it, because Jesus wants the very best for us. So I just want to end simply praying the words that are at the end of Psalm 139 as a prayer for us this morning as we go out on into our weeks and in all that is ahead. So simply pray, search me, God, and know me. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Search me, God. Know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Amen.